Well, thanks very much to Bidisha for the warm introduction, and thank you very much to the conference organizers. It's such a delight always to be in the Maison Française, and I am so thrilled to be here in person. It's just such a great privilege. It really is. So here are some kind of thoughts and responses to the idea of thematic ethics that this conference raises. I'm not, or not any longer really a migration studies expert. I am pondering the strange dimensions and challenges and kind of striations of migration to the south, the counterintuitive direction. I have a very rudimentary PowerPoint just to give you something to look at. This was one of the things about online talks, wasn't it? That there was always a PowerPoint for you to look at, so you could kind of, you know, switch off your own screen and look at the PowerPoint. So the invisibility of southern migration. We generally think of the refugee condition as involving movement in a northerly direction to fortress Europe or through Central America towards the US-Mexico border. I have myself explored this vector in my fiction, in particular in a story called Synthetic Orange Into the Volcano, which I've been seeing has a clear concern for a conference on thematic ethics. And actually, I was thinking for a sort of a breathy, daring moment yesterday that I could better spend this keynote simply reading you the story. Yeah. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll distribute the story and everyone can read, we can read it together and talk about it. But I resisted. My proper academic self stepped back to the front of the stage. So in this paper, I want to look at migration in a southerly direction and at the migrant condition as a condition, therefore, of island incarceration. Oops. The southern hemisphere, we remember here, is a watery hemisphere comprised of around 81% of ocean. Therefore, to be a migrant, to be a refugee moving south in the southern hemisphere necessarily involves crossings on risky crossings, right? Threatened with drowning, as we will see with Buchani. I want to draw in my remarks on selected southern writers of or towards the south, to make my case for the migrant condition in the south as a condition of island incarceration. I will touch on, necessarily briefly, Karen Jennings, Behrooz Buchani, Johnny Steinberg, and Alexis Wright, but first opening with a framing text by J.M. Coetzee. In my commentary on their work, I want to ask, together with you, what are the genres of refugee writing in and towards the South? Are they different than the genres of writing to the North? How do these writers use their writing to give shape to the formlessness and invisibility of those banished from history, whose state is not so much one of near death as purgatorial and suspended? Or, as Alexis Wright writes, oases of abandonment. Are narrative forms like testimony or memoir the most effective for communicating this refugee experience to the South? What other kinds of writings do the writers investigate, which might allow them to explore the refugee gap between here and there, this island and that one, effectively? Right? So think about this gap between here and there, this island and that one. The frame of the paper comes from a perhaps unlikely quarter, J.M. Coetzee's Jesus novel trilogy. This set of 3 novels published in 2013, 2016, 2019 did not at first seem to be about migration at all, but now in 2020, the situation looks rather different. Sorry, there are my texts. The situation looks very different. The trilogy has been backlit by events that unfolded in the waters around Australia, even as the trilogy was in progress, 2013, 2016, 2019. Events that the publication of Behrouz Boochani's No Friend But the Mountains have further exposed. Under this light, the Jesus novels emerge as studies in migration, studies that explore the ambiguities of crossing over and arriving in a seemingly new life, as it's repeatedly called. But this so-called new life ends in death, the death of the central character, the child David, who is also the promised child of the title. He's the Jesus figure. And you know, this isn't a spoiler alert because the death of the central character is announced on the as the title of the 3rd novel in the trilogy. The childhood of Jesus, the school days of Jesus, and the final novel, The Death of Jesus, dramatize this arrival in a new land, this arrival in a southerly direction as a one-way experience with no possibility of return. The condition inhabited by migrants is characterized by contingency, isolation, repetition, and the experience of being in translation, divorced from mother tongue as well as motherland. I'll come back to those points in a moment. The form of the fictions is fabular. They're very, very puzzling fictions. They are very, very different for those who know Coetzee's work and admire it, very, very different from his previous work. The form is fabular, and the attempt is repeatedly, especially in The Death of Jesus, to draw lessons from the life and experience of the child David, stroke Jesus. However, after he dies of a cruel, muscle-wasting illness, his adoptive father, Simon, searches in vain for what his life might have meant. The effect is at once cumulative and strangely anticlimactic, and the trilogy peters out, as if intentionally, into Simon's fretful complaints about inconclusiveness and lack of meaning. So I'll spend a bit of time sort of talking about that, and then I'll touch more briefly on the other accounts of migration south that I have mentioned. Jennings, Boochani, Steinberg, in collaboration with Assad. Finally, I will touch on the situation of internal migration and exile in Australia in the dystopian novel, The Swan Book by Alexis Wright, which I propose stands as a kind of epigraph and epitaph, a degree 0, to the other fictional and poetic works that I'm talking about. So the Jesus trilogy. The central characters in the novels, Simon and his adopted son David, in their new land, retain little more than shadowy memories of their past, if that. Even the memory of the language they may once have spoken is washed from their minds. They have been assigned new names and ages and identities and an unfamiliar new language, Spanish, that they have to learn. And Simon's Spanish, for example, visibly improves across the course of the trilogy. Migration has little obvious benefit or purpose for them, other than holding onto or having life itself. For example, a quote from the text, "The harbor master at Belle Star," that's a camp, "won't let anyone take the boat back to the old life. He's very strict about that, no return." David keeps asking Simon about the worth of this new life, and Simon rarely, if ever, has an adequate answer for him, and no wonder. The ends of their journeys are cul-de-sacs, leading to camps or camp-like institutions such as Belle Star, the relocation center in Novia, which is one of the new countries, or the Punta Arenas Reformatory School, and finally death in hospital in the case of David, and a slow diminishment of energy and interest in the case of Simon. Simon and David's migrations take place within a relatively featureless, culturally depleted space, seemingly located in the far southern hemisphere, within its Spanish-speaking regions, not unlike the countries of the real-life southern cone of South America. So there's some sort of sense that this might be Argentina and it might be Chile. Certainly there are associations of Patagonia. So very, very far south, very remote, the sense of an island apart. There is no sense in the novels that migration leads endlessly forward to a retreating frontier or better conditions, that there's always somewhere to move on to. The places of migration in the trilogy are far from the places where the pace of historical development is dictated. And these are the characteristics of migration and the migrant condition in the Jesus trilogy. We have here an old-fashioned world lost in time, full of copies, no originals. For example, David carries around a copy of Don Quixote without any sense that this is a book by a novel by Cervantes. No, the name Cervantes never occurs. There is television, but there is no internet. So it's a strange sort of old-fashioned world, a sort of 1930s world lost in time, full of copies, no originals. Social life is isolated and isolating. Day-to-day life is marked by the circular repetition of experiences. This is important, I think, rather than onward linear progression, right? In an island situation, you keep going round and round. You can't get off, you can't move on. Apart from the experience of crossing the border itself. And this is vividly captured in Simon's stevedoring work on the docks, transporting heavy sacks of grain off ships. And then there's this experience of living in translation. In short, the migrant worlds of the Jesus trilogy occupy the bad infinity described by Simon's friend Eugenio, that is an infinite recursion, like finding yourself in a dream, within yet another dream, and so forth endlessly, yet without any sense of a source from which those dreams come. This is exacerbated again by the fact that the characters have nothing but shadowy memories of their life before and of their original language. Everything of where they have come from has been stripped away. Karen Jennings, in the equally fable-like novel An Island, longlisted for the Booker Prize last year, describes the island condition of Samuel, the lighthouse keeper, in strikingly similar terms. Circular, isolated, out on the edge, the characters, the main character, Samuel, subject to history, not subjects of it. The titular island in the novel is located somewhere off the South African coast, not unlike Robben Island, for example, an island of incarceration. And Samuel is the one inhabitant. As I said, he's the lighthouse keeper. Yet bodies wash up on the coast, victims of atrocities on the mainland, 32 in 23 years, it's said. The island is a place where you would send someone to die. Samuel is obliged to bury the bodies on the island with great difficulty because it's a very rocky island. And he does so in a sort of cyclical way until a live migrant washes up on the island. And then it's a question of whether the island can sustain a community of two. In the Coetzee trilogy and in the Karen Jennings An Island, there is no prospect of return to the land or mainland that the characters migrated from. David, in the death of Jesus, dies in this foreign land without ever finding his real mother. The lighthouse keeper is obliged to bury the washed up bodies on his island. They will not be returned to their countries. In more recent work than the Jesus novels, which casts the trilogy in the prophetic light in which I've been trying to represent it, Coetzee's thanatic view on southern migration has become bleaker and more uncompromising. In a review essay, Australia's Shame on Behrouz Boochani's No Friend But the Mountains, Coetzee represents his adopted Australia as a place beyond the edge, a fortress guarded by purgatorial prison islands. Not for these migrants, he writes, the fairly comfortable, if tedious, circularity of tending orchards or teaching dance, as in the Jesus trilogy. Instead, migrants come up against unbreachable, if invisible, barriers in the ocean itself. For boat-borne asylum seekers to Australia, Coetzee observes, the very act of seeking refuge is met with punishment, quote, punishment that will be and is meant to be as harsh as possible, visible for all the world to see. Their migration does not bring any kind of arrival, only indefinite detention as illegal non-citizens on prison islands. Their hoped-for crossing over is permanently suspended. There is no key to the nation's door for these people, and the door, unlike that to Simon and David's windowless room in the childhood of Jesus, is shut against them in perpetuity. Those sentences were kind of interspersed with quotes from Australia's Shame. And Coetzee cites Monash University's Australian border deaths database estimates in support of his claims. There have been a total of some 2,000 refugee drownings in the ocean between Indonesia and Australia since the year 2000, he writes. The Australian historian Christina Twomey's memoir essay about prison islands, also written in 2019, like Australia's Shame, helps to sharpen this critique still further. Australia's exclusive island continent identity depends upon hyper-protection, she writes, walled exclusion and terror. Quote, extraterritoriality in the form of islands has bequeathed the Australian state to, extraterritoriality in the form of islands has bequeathed the Australian state the capacity to practice terror in the name of its citizens. And she points out also in this essay that this policy on migration is the policy of both of the dominant parties, both Labour and the Liberal Party. So you know, the electorate supports it either way. So now I'd like to move on to the sort of the second section of this paper, the form of migration south. So far, I've touched on fable-like novels, the Jennings and the Coetzee, that seem at once to offer and yet withhold a lesson about migration south, and also resist the conventional behavior of the fable. I now, as in resist giving lessons, the lesson seems to peter out. Is it a lesson about moving on? Is it a lesson about avoiding the prison island? The lesson is unclear, and yet that is what the fable is meant to deliver. I now want to ask some questions about the forms of migrant and refugee writing south, this region of counter-conventional migration. How does writing give shape to the alleged formlessness of refugee life, the cul-de-sacs, the purgatorial aspects of life in the camp? How does it capture the repetitiveness without simply reiterating it? Or to hone the question, is narrative the most effective medium for this, given its linearity, how it moves forward in time, where, as we've already seen, southern migrations are repetitive, circular, delta-like, and petering out like the shapes of the southern continents themselves, petering out into the Southern Ocean. Boochani's work, and certainly, sorry, I keep flicking. Boochani's work, and certainly Wright's, pull away from the conventions of life writing in the first case and the novel in the second. Johnny Steinberg, which I also touch on, follows the linear tracks of memoir, the tracks to South Africa rather than Australia, a land-based track rather than an oceanic down the African continent. But the story, A Man of Good Hope, is a collected testimony, one elicited from the subject through daily 1-hour interviews, with added thematic organization and analysis. So these three texts, I'm saying, pull away from the conventions of testimony, pull away from the conventions of life writing and from the novel. They seem to be wanting a different kind of form to articulate the weirdness, the end-stopness of migration south. Behrouz Boochani's No Friend But the Mountains, the book that Coetzee in that sort of, excoriating review essay was writing about, is a migration memoir about imprisonment on Manus Island. The book opens with Boochani on his second attempt to cross over from Indonesia to Australia. The first time he nearly drowned, the second time they are nearly drowned again, and individuals do drown. There's a horrific scene of somebody who can't swim, who sadly drowns. On the point of starvation on this unseaworthy vessel in this ocean between Indonesia and Australia, on the point of starvation, they are met first by a British ship that gives them food, and then by an Australian warship that refuses to allow them to proceed into Australian waters and deports them as if they were prisoners of war, as Boochani writes, first to Christmas Island and then to Manus Island on Nauru. They are to be made an example of, as Boochani writes, quote, "The deal is that we have to be a warning, a lesson for people who want to seek protection in Australia. The camp on Manus is unhealthy, dangerous, and destructive of their psychic stability, but also of their very humanity. Prisoners cry for their pasts left behind, for people left behind, though many fled their countries of origin in fear of their lives." So arrival here is non-arrival. Migration is suspension. Asylum seekers to Australia are held not at a border, but in an extraterritorial no man's land, to which, moreover, hundreds keep on coming. Or, to intersperse Coetzee again, as the officer, the immigration officer in the Jesus Trilogy says, "There are thousands of entries, hundreds of thousands, more than you can count," while also pointing out that there is a reception center in every city. Southern migration means, certainly as represented by Boochani, a condition of interminable waiting on closely guarded prison islands, along with hundreds of others. On the question of form, this crucial question of form, No Friend But the Mountains was written as straight reportage. It was not written as straight reportage, sorry, but in the form of text messages sent one by one on a secret mobile phone in Farsi to the outside world. And significantly, Boochani, back in his native Iran, was a poet. And the text is duly interspersed with frequent quotation of Boochani's own poems translated into English, which themselves create the effect of short text messages captured within the text. These poetic inserts support, heighten, or reinforce points made in the narrative, and immediately raise the question of whether in migrant contexts, poetry might offer a more evocative and yet cryptic medium, intentionally cryptic medium, for migrant experience. As we already saw, Coetzee and Jennings use fable-like story forms and allegory in which the underlying meaning is coded or hidden to tell their migrant stories. So there seems to be a tending in these writings towards a writing that is more coded, more suggestive, rather than literal. I'm reminded here of British Somali poet Warshan Shire's poem Home, which some of you may know, which gives voice to the terror of refugee migration northwards from the war-torn lands on Europe's periphery, Somalia in her case. From its first words, Home, a performance poem, drags its listeners or readers into a headlong flight from a home that has become hateful, something akin also to the urge of Nobese Phillips' broken slave voices to flee the Zong's violent deck in her poem Zong, which you heard about yesterday. declaimed as if on the move, Warsan Shire's poem Home sweeps us through the terrifying civil war from which it is escaping, yet to which it also insistently returns, only once more to flee. Just an excerpt from the poem to give you the sense of this very powerful sort of insistent incantatory writing. This kind of feeling that poetry and not narrative can evoke. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. That sense of sort of masses on the move again. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. In Buchani's No Friend But the Mountains, the poems perform another function, therefore, than of heightening or reinforcing the experience being described. The work is preoccupied both with telling the truth of Buchani's experience, yet at the same time, it knows that it cannot reveal other refugee detainee identities, as in the opening disclaimer. There's a disclaimer from Buchani and from the translator to say that identities have been disguised, amalgamated, intentionally confused. So the poems in the text, embedded in the text, also work as a kind of code, a way of deflecting from and masking the individual experiences being described. As in allegory, individuals also bear generic names, such as the friend of the blue-eyed boy, Mani with the bowed leg. And I'd like to, in the spirit of being in person and of sharing a live text, I'd just like to read from the text. If I'd had a bit more time, I would have liked to share this as a text on the screen, but I just want to show you, I don't know if you can see this, how the poem is embedded in the narrative. Okay, and this goes on throughout. It's a feature of the text. So I'm going to begin in this reading from page 88 with the narrative section, and then you'll see how it sort of moves over to the poem. I'll kind of raise my hand as the poem comes in. In these moments, I don't know what to do with myself. I stand up from my chair and wander around the tightly confined cage. I still don't know why they pulled us out of the camp so early in the morning. I still have no idea why we had to spend hours doing the rounds of the soulless cages. Still no clue why they kept body searching us. The only thing that comes to mind is that they wanted to torment us at any cost. Sometimes I peer over unobtrusively at that scabby-headed prison warden, just waiting for him to perform another magic trick for us, just waiting for him to pull out another smoke. This is somebody who was a prison warden in his old life, is now a refugee. But he is inattentive and just chats away loudly with his friends. I can't sense a desire for smoking in him now. I believe what is happening to me, all that hardship, all that wandering from place to place, all that starvation I had to endure, all of it, so that I could arrive on Australian soil. I cannot believe I'm now being exiled to Manus, a tiny island out in the middle of the ocean. My roaming is gradually making my head spin. I also feel that the others aren't impressed by me walking around. So a strong sense of sameness and refugees there as the enemy. In Australia's shame, Coetzee points to the messy, though more humane situation facing migrants in another part of the South, South Africa, compared to Australia, though the former, South Africa, is not so rich a country. Yet here too, as Steinberg points out, migrants such as his subject, the Somali migrant Assad, face intense xenophobia and the repeated loss of their property through theft and attack. There are many, many things to say about this fascinating testimony story of making it across Africa, excuse me, across Africa from Somalia to Johannesburg and then Cape Town. But on the question of form, I'll confine myself to two remarks. One is to say that it's a work of remembering and remembering, right? Putting dismembered things back together. One whose form feels appropriate as it resembles the lineages of his family that Assad has been taught to remember along with the Quran. Right? His education up to the age of 14 comprised learning the Quran and learning the lineages of his family. So there's something about the linearity of the text. So Steinberg, with Assad's help, Assad the subject, you kind of putting his story back together, even as he walks down the African continent, from refugee camp to refugee camp, Ethiopia, Kenya, and then all the way down to South Africa. So the form is appropriate in that sense. The second point is that Assad himself, looking back on his life, says that he wants to avoid seeing a mere chronology of loss, a linear, repetitive account of loss after loss, right? The kind of thing that might be end-stopped or heightened by, a series of poems embedded in the text. The alternative vision that Steinberg offers him in writing the book and writing his story is of, quote, a series of sparks or flashes, a selection of moments that gives him more of a sense of agency, right? This is a formed text. This is a remolded text. It gives a sense of agency. The pattern is more like poetry. It takes him away from the imprisoning repetition of one thing after another. In this story, quote, he was the one who decided what would happen next. Okay, so this sort of sense of not being subjected to history or to the condition of the migrant, but of kind of forming that condition yourself. And it's interesting. This is highlighted by Steinberg that Assad is a doer. He's constantly kind of on the move, on the make, kind of even in situations of incredible deprivation, he's kind of thinking about the next thing to do. And that impetus kind of drives the story, A Man of Good Hope. And then finally, a novel that doesn't seem to be about migration or the refugee condition at all, and yet is entirely about it. For Indigenous Australian writer Alexis Wright in the Swan Book, a situation of suspended life pertains also to those Indigenous Australians who have never left their country, but who are prevented through poverty, through deprivation, through legal exclusion, who are prevented from arriving in contemporary modern Australia, just as migrants are. Alexis Wright meditates in the Swan Book on the ironies of Indigenous self-alienation, what it is to be denied belonging in the country of your birth, and sees in this an implicit correlate for accounts of refugee camps on places like Manus Island. She uses a poetic technique, although this is a novel, of close obsessive focus, expressed in a variety of repetitive effects, to reflect on this condition, this harrowing condition of internal yet external incarceration. The Swan Book is a speculative fiction set in a dystopian future in an environment absolutely ruined by climate change. Indigenous people are living under a regime called the Intervention in the north of the country, and their setting where they are living, their refugee camp, is a drying out swamp to which thousands of black swans have been driven from other parts of the country. The central character is called Oblivia Etheline, or Oblivia Ethel, and it's the situation is kind of told from her point of view. Indigenous Australian critic Evelyn Araluen makes a comment that speaks directly to this kind of complex of images of the drying out swamp, the raped 14-year-old Oblivia, and the black swans in the following comment. The colonizers have not left, but instead police our borders and imprison those who seek asylum from conflicts in which we are implicated. This is outlined as the Australian logic of elimination, which is a dual project, erasing the native for the benefit of land acquisition and the establishment of the settler colony, while simultaneously cultivating a symbolic return of the native through tourism, for example, to influence and demarcate the colony's point of departure from the imperial center. An additional complexity in this configuration is the offshore detention of refugees and asylum seekers, many of whom are themselves dispossessed indigenous peoples. So that quote from Araluen kind of neatly puts together the image of the swamp community of internal refugees and the external refugees on prison islands in the situation of contemporary Australia. The swamp is both a kind of apartheid homeland and an internment camp, and is a correlate for the southern prison island camp, the one that I've been touching on across this talk. It is loaded with rubbish. It is impossible to leave. And in a quote from the text, in this oasis of abandonment, home for thousands forcibly removed from other more visible parts of Australia by the government, the swamp became a well-known compound for legally interning whoever needed to be secluded far away behind a high razor-edged fence from the decent people of mainstream civilization. You can feel the anger in that quote. You can also see that it's kind of not a conventional novel at all. It's almost a sort of policy document. And another quote, it was the same here as in dozens of fenced and locked Aboriginal detention centers across the continent. So Alexis Wright in the Swan Book, she shrugs off the burden of reportage that we find in Steinberg and even Buchani in the narrative sections kind of between, that's kind of string the poetry together. By bringing in climate change, she also reinforces the toxicity of place in which both people and things and even animal and stories, or as she writes, story traditions are dumped. We are back in the bad infinity described by Coetzee, repetitiveness without purpose, endless waiting, even the stories are unmoored from the traditions that they come from, as with the Cervantes. The past is forgotten, your original language is wiped out. This is the condition of Southern migration. And another final quote from Alexis Wright. They already knew what it was like to lose country. Still, it did not pay to fret about the world when you were imprisoned. They were already the overcrowded kind of people living in the world's most unknown detention camp right in Australia that still liked to call itself a first world country. The traditional owners of the land locked up forever. Thank you.
Very much for that very powerful presentation. It's such a treat to have you with us. Thank you. So the floor is open. Elsa.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very powerful. And I have questions about. I have two short questions about local ordinances. Because I think this book has been awarded the highest literary prize in Australia. Has not been granted the citizenship. So, if I understand well, this book had quite an impact on the debate about migration in Australia. And so, this is the only question I have: how something written with such coded, such as you said, a cryptic style, will have a stronger impact than the activist work, which was documenting the conditions in the prison long before the book. So how, you know, how this kind of poetic style could be stronger than very literal witnessing of these subordinate conditions. And in continuation to this, I was wondering if you tell us your opinion about the very last part of the book about the Keynote system, is hierarchization of the women's prison organization, and what is the relationship of this last part with the rest? How do you understand this?
Did everyone hear the questions? Yeah. So the first question on Bucciani's kind of poetic style, the kind of the literary effect, and how powerful it was compared to, say, activist work on Manus Island. Well, in a way, that's what I was trying to say, also citing the War Sanshire, that there's something about, I mean, I'm a literary critic, so I would say this, but I think there is something about the poetry that is very powerful. It taps into, I mean, it taps into emotional resources that we have that maybe activist documents don't. I mean, you know, it's interesting that, right, I mean, I was only able to quote from here and there. It's a sort of strange and remarkable, very, very difficult to read text. And it too uses sort of poetic effects, you know, kind of, you know, is in particular a sort of rhythmic, kind of refrain-like effect, a chant-like effect. And arguably that's what Bucciani is also doing in the sections of poetry. I mean, I find the poetry a little frustrating because it's translated, and I'm not sure how good the translation is, but nonetheless, you know, it's very clear that poetry, the resources of poetry, are being used to tap into readers' emotions or listeners' emotions. So I think that's the answer there. And of course, yes, I mean, I think Australian writers came together to, you know, to say something to their government about about conditions on Manus Island, and about the Australian government's policy towards migrants with that prize, because it's a national literary award and they gave it to a non-national. So, you know, that spoke volumes. Yeah, I mean, you know, Bucciani is an intellectual, and he while there, he clearly invested of his time in theorizing his condition, you know, the condition sort of with the officers and the locals, you know, Manus locals or Papua New Guinea locals, and
He says the Papoose.
yes, and it's this sort of, I mean, the system that he theorizes is a sort of system of silos, and, you know, and kind of you know, sections of hierarchies that don't interrelate, and a kind of dog-eat-dog situation. Again, I mean, I don't entirely, I have to say, I struggle to understand it fully, but I was absolutely willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, because what he's doing is he's exercising his mind in a situation where, you know, there aren't the resources to do so, and he is an intellectual, he's a writer. So what, yeah, what did you think? Did you, I mean,
about the theory?
Yes, yes.
For me, it was a way to reflect, to try to step back, maybe to use another part of the brain.
Yeah.
Because it's true that the first part of the book is more aiming towards emotions, and maybe
Yeah.
to reflect differently. I had the chance to discuss with this translator.
Okay.
And they've been working very closely. So well, and now that they are really working together since then. So it's true that it's frustrating because it told me that it was very difficult to translate, and we had to ask advice to other writers for doing this work. But
For the poetry or for the theory, as it were?
for the poetry.
Yeah, for the poetry. Yeah.
But I think this is probably the best translation we could have had.
Thank you.
So that's the aspect. So recently published a book with a chapter with the ruse and co-written with his translator for this. I meant to be him. It's important to name him as a collaborator. We've said a few times that the translator, and to recognise that they do work in collaboration and have done through the process of the tweets that kind of gave the ruse the status and worldwide attention that led to this. And it's just so kind of note that. But yeah, there's always that challenge of translation, thinking about translation for audience as well, not just kind of linguistically, but through this type of virus with this kind of book. But actually, I wanted to ask about if you felt there were, or was noticing the names that were coming up, so not only the Jesus trilogy, but David, Simon, Simon, Samuel, if there were intentional or if there was possible readings, the biblical references there, and thinking of the exile and those in the context of the Christian narratives that David, Simon, Samuel, Jesus all come from. I don't know if it's intentional
I think it's absolutely intentional. I mean, in a trilogy in which all three novels bear the name Jesus, who, however, doesn't feature as a character in the novels themselves and the action of the novels. Those kind of biblical points of reference are not only implicit but explicit. It's tricksy in the Coetzee because these kind of biblical points of reference, the names signified by the stories signified by the names, slip into and out of focus. I think An Island is quite indebted in interesting ways, although it must have been written sort of simultaneously or in parallel with the final novel in the trilogy. But I think it's quite indebted to Coetzee, the kind of the allegorical style, the biblical name, the island context is very reminiscent of islands in other Coetzee works. But yeah, there's a lot of allegory, and as I said, a sort of fabulous sort of lesson giving effect in both a trilogy and An Island. And it's to me, it's very interesting that is the case, that the refugee condition in the southerly direction kind of produces these. I mean, to go back to the valuable point about talking about the translator, that these stories require a kind of would demand a kind of framing, a kind of remaking. They are not, as it were, kind of effusions from the heart. I mean, you don't, that rawness that we see here on the War Saint-Chiré that we see up on the screen is something that in the southern narratives, be it Steinberg and Assad working together, or be it Buchani and his translator working together, they are kind of couched in a way that a story that is allegorical is also couched in a certain tradition, as in the biblical tradition in this sense. I think there's something there worth thinking about, that these stories perhaps need some kind of or demand some kind of decoding or a kind of platform from which to speak.
Thank you for read Chan's book, but listening to you, at some point you said that poetry seems to tap into emotions more than prose, I would say. And it's a question that I've been working on, and I still don't have answers. So to listen to you, would you say that is to some extent trying to trigger readers' empathy? And if so, what do you make of this empathy? And I have in mind an article written by Zambian writer Wally Self-Help, who an article called The Banality of Empathy. She says, you know, if you trigger empathy, what's next in different texts? Is there anything that follows this empathy? So I don't know if my question is clear, but well, maybe it's not.
No,
Because it didn't use the term empathy, but is that something that?
yeah, it's a fascinating essay by Namwali Serpel, The Banality of Empathy. I mean, so there's so much to say in response to your question, so I can't do the question justice, but as when we talk about fable or allegory, as we've been doing, or ancient story traditions, as Alexis Wright does throughout the Swan Book, we're talking about very sort of, you know, ancient resources in and of the human. So I might respond to Namwali. You know what? Okay, so what happens after empathy? Well, empathy is everything. You know, it is. I think, you know, you may have noticed in this paper an underlying sort of tendency to move away from the linear. I'm much more interested in the kind of the circular and the rhythmic. So, you know, to enter into the heart of a situation through the power of language, the situation of another, is surely, I mean, that's why, you know, Buchani and, you know, that's why he did what he did. That's why he disseminated, you know, what he was going through these text messages and you know, used poetic form. I think, you know, we can't do enough with poetry in situations where we're wanting to draw attention to the terrible state, the predicament of the refugee in today's world. I think you know, empathy is the beginning and the end, and that is how literature works, and in particular poetry, of course. It takes us right, the power of the language. And, you know, the language is not just kind of words on the page, it is breath, it is heart, rhythm, it is the body. This, you know, momentarily as we hear Warsan Shira's words there, we enter into that situation that she describes. I mean, yeah, I feel that very strongly.
Thank you. Other question?
That lady over there.
Yeah, yes, thank you for the beautiful paper. I was intrigued by what you said by a new genre that would, for migrant writing. It seems to me that books, although I haven't written them all, what would be then the unifying link between, or would you see a common genre in the books that you just presented today, or what would the thread be? Or, you know?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really useful question. Thank you. Because it sort of requires me to kind of try to say what I was driving at in a talk that was quite impressionistic and, you know, it's kind of layered quotes. I suppose what I'm registering in these texts that I've been talking about is a restlessness and impatience around the narrative form. I think we have, and certainly in other work that I do, I use narrative as a, as a very powerful medium to, as we say in, it's a group called the Accelerate Hub that I work on. A narrative is a very important way to elicit people's stories, to give them voice, although that's a very problematic construction in itself. But what I'm registering in these texts is a sense that narrative doesn't, straightforward novelistic narrative doesn't do enough. Alexis Wright is extremely, this is her third novel, and she has written 3 novels, and each one of them is, as I say, speculative, kind of estranged from the novel form. The Bucciani is not straightforward narrative. The Steinberg isn't, and interestingly, the Steinberg has now been adapted very, very successfully for the stage, with a sort of a semi-operatic stage production, which I strongly recommend to, if it ever comes to your patch. So there's a sense that the refugee predicament, and because that's what I'm working on at the moment, in a southerly direction, but the refugee predicament, whether north or south, is not adequately captured in linear form. That's what it comes down to. Beginning, middle, end stories. There's this kind of this movement towards allegory and fable, as I've said, which is often a failed movement. What does it all add up to? The Jesus trilogy really struggles to do anything with the allegory that it sets up. An Island is very, very bleak, but nonetheless, these books, they're trying to move to some other kind of form to capture this experience. And what I've said about Bucciani and the kind of the chopped up text, the strangest things happen in the Swan Book, and the swirling of swans around the world, and then we keep coming back to the swan. So there's a sort of repetitive poetic structure in that. Anyway, as you can tell, I could go on, but it's a sort of, it's an impatience, and real impatience with linear form. It doesn't deliver enough.
Yeah.
And maybe that goes back to the question of empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's also perhaps a temporality, that there's no continuity implied as well.
Yes. And also,
I was wondering whether there was some form of therapeutic value, say, in short poems that at least give shape to one day. If you don't know where you're going, at least that instant.
yeah, great point. I mean, there's also the kind of narrative, conventional narrative is also a kind of obscenity in a situation where, as with Bucciani, there is the narrative describes a trajectory, beginning, middle, end. We start somewhere, we open out. Anne Tyler was, I was listening to her on the radio the other day. She's saying, and a conventional narrative is like an eye. It's got a small bit and then opens, and then it goes small bit, the tending towards death. But that trajectory is disallowed in the Bucciani. It's A Man of Good Hope. Assad is repeatedly frustrated. He can't complete that narrative arc. So there's kind of something obscene to that curve in the refugee condition. Perhaps that too.
It's interesting because there almost seems to be this parallel between the form and what you're calling island incarceration, right? This idea of not being able to return, and the kind of circularity of the island, with the kind of incantation of the poetic form seems to be a little there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there's also a lot more to say. I didn't have time to develop it. And there's also a lot to say about the washing away of memory. And what that does to narrative shape. You know, perhaps the poetic form, the sort of short, concentrated pieces are much more of, you know, of kind of, in some sense, much more sort of natural to the situation.
Claudine.
I'm listening to you. I was wondering if it was useful to think of a very different relationship to reference. To say that it's not we're writing it from testimony in order to start about what you were saying about ambiguity and about poetry. Because the reference must be at a different place. And one sentence that say with different meanings or different meaning.
Can you just, is that a comment or a question? Sorry.
It's a question about thinking theoretically about autobiographical writing.
Yes.
Since you're describing that moving away from life writing, that's different. Specifically, if you think about empathy, and if you think about the ways in which autobiographical writing from refugees, etc., have a direct, supposedly a direct effect on the reader because they are lived experiences. So what you're saying here, I think, could be a way of thinking about reference that is very different from autobiographical writing in relation to referential.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just that I'm thinking about, what you were saying about forms and impact.
And I mean, a reference, of course, also works very in very challenging ways, where, you know, as I was saying, the identities have had to be obscured. You know, reference is dangerous. You know, it is emphasized in the, you know, in the translator's note that, you know, it would be impossible to follow up on these identities, even though the names given, you know, the man with the bowed leg or what, are quite specific. Yeah, reference is deliberately obscured. And of course, in the Coetzee, which is why, again, I think the trilogy is so sort of prescient in its strange way, that, you know, reference is also confused and frustrated by the fact that the characters don't have their mother tongue, and they have no memory of their mother tongue. So and there are sort of really interesting moments in the text where Spanish is used, but incorrectly, because the characters don't. It's not their mother tongue, but they don't have another. They don't have either a memory of their former language or a common medium other than this new language to speak in. So yeah, reference is the kind of, you know, the relationship of signifier to signified is blocked in interesting but different ways in all these texts. Yeah. I mean, in the Swan Book, for example, this is one of the things that makes it so difficult and frustrating to read is that you told a certain thing about a character, and then that is contradicted 5 pages later. Oh, they're 35 years old, or they're 75 years, you know, so you go back and you're forced to go back and forth. So again, reference is frustrated. Yeah.
All right, we're running out of time. Do you want to very quickly?
Yes,
to be the last
basically just
question.
a comment, and also I think it's just, I think it's interesting coming from migration and the border studies, where we also have these discussions of not making non-video trajectories when we talk about migrants, and not just describing the movement to B or a state-centric lens, or can also see migration as movement from A to B. So it's very interesting, this interdisciplinary exchange where you can see that also in fiction, and I guess it's not that surprising that it's people with migration experience that write some of these books you mentioned, but it's also interesting if it's looking out into the literature of people with a Tuscan.
Thank you very much.